Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today on the Middle East Brief, we are going to do a little bit of a crossover podcast where we bring in fellows affiliated with the program that sits right next to me in the office, the Eurasia program, FPRI's largest, to talk about the intersection of geopolitics, both as it pertains to Syria, but also more broadly in the Middle East and how it intersects with Russia. Joining me on the show is Bob Hamilton, a professor of Eurasian Studies at the U.S. Army War College and a Black Sea Fellow at FPRI, and Nik Gvosdev, Captain of Jerome E. Levy Chair of Economic Geography and National Security at the Naval War College, and also a Eurasia Fellow at FPRI. So welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks, Aaron.
You know, I want to start with you, Bob. As we were joking off pod before we started here, you wrote a piece for FPRI last Friday, although last Friday, we're recording this on Wednesday, and it's 3:20 East Coast time. Feels like forever ago with our way our news cycle works. But basically about the crisis unfolding, or that was unfolding, continues to unfold in Syria's Idlib, where Turkish forces were in near direct clashes with forces from Russia, the regime, and Iran, and why that matters for U.S. national security interests and U.S. foreign policy. So, I mean, it's been a couple of days since the piece. I mean, what are your thoughts on what's going on?
Sure. Thanks, Aaron. So, yeah, I think there are three really major reasons why Western governments should not take their eye off of what's happening in Idlib. The first is, despite the fact that there's a ceasefire right now that was put in place after a meeting last week, there's still the potential for direct military clash between Russia and Turkey, whether it's intentional or inadvertent due to a misperception or a miscalculation. The fact that Turkey, as a NATO member, has forces in Idlib province and has for well over a year as part of a de-escalation agreement. At least 33 Turkish forces were killed by the Syrian regime back in late February on the 27th, and that elicited an overwhelming Turkish response that really hurt the regime's military capability. That's what precipitated the Putin-Erdogan meeting and the ceasefire. My sense is the ceasefire is unlikely to hold for the long term. No ceasefire in Syria has. The Russian military and the Assad regime, as soon as the tactical military situation is favorable to them, and if they can find a way to clear Idlib province without engaging Turkey militarily, they will. So this ceasefire is unlikely to hold, and unless the Turks leave Idlib, which is very unlikely because their military presence is there to protect some of the groups, the anti-Assad opposition groups that Turkey backs. So unless the Turks leave, which is unlikely, a clash between Russia and Turkey is still very much possible. The second reason I think it matters is the humanitarian catastrophe that's really already unfolding. Close to 1 million internally displaced people have been pushed north and west in Idlib province toward the Turkish border. There's somewhere around 960,000 of them sheltering in about 200 makeshift camps along the Turkish border. Russian and Syrian attacks, which have been indiscriminate in Idlib as they have been elsewhere in the country, have killed at least 800 civilians since the offensive began in December. And so you have an unfolding humanitarian crisis. And then the third reason I think we should be paying attention is this situation could be a source of instability or even conflict, political, maybe not military conflict, between Turkey and its EU neighbors. So Turkey ceased implementation of the agreement with the European Union, under which, in exchange for financial aid, the Turkish government would prevent the 3.5 million refugees, Syrian refugees that Turkey is already hosting, from seeking to enter the EU. So the Turks, about 10 days ago, stopped enforcing that agreement, and they haven't actively facilitated the exit of these Syrian refugees, but they haven't prevented it. And so there already have been clashes along the Greek-Turkish border, not military clashes, but Greek border forces have used force against refugees trying to cross into Greece. not intentional deadly force, but nevertheless, people have died along the border and have died at sea trying to get out of Turkey and into the EU. The Turkish police have now established a presence on the border to keep Greece from pushing these refugees back into Turkey. So this is, again, an unfolding source of instability and potential conflict between Turkey and its neighbors in the European Union. And then, of course, the final reason that's connected to this is if there is a mass exodus of people out of Idlib province through Turkey and into the EU, the fact that a lot of the groups in Idlib are affiliated with HTS, which is the former Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, means that certainly some of those people fleeing Idlib province are bad people that we don't want in the European Union. In other words, part of an organization that's a UN-designated terrorist organization. So those are really the three reasons I think we should be paying more attention to Idlib than we are.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in before I jump over to you, Nick, is, people focus on the one strike that killed, I think it was 34, 33, 34,
yeah.
I can't remember, but, throughout the entire month, as the Turks were building up forces, there was at least a dozen more that were also killed before the large strike, and then there were more after the strike. So, I keep a pretty close watch, and it was, I think it's up over 50 in total that have been killed in Idlib, and so it was not without consequence. Nick, I want to jump over to you, what do you make of all this? The Russians, clearly the Turks were able to put some hurt on the regime, but the ceasefires seem to settle on an outcome that would be maybe not favorable to Russian interests, but at least advances the Russian position in Syria because it gives them control of the highways, assuming it doesn't break down, as I agree with Bob. What do you think the Russians are up to in Syria, and where do you think their position is now, again, on Wednesday?
Well, this is a great question, and it requires us to back up a bit to look at what was happening in Syria in the last months of 2019. So let me give you my own opinion about where I think all of this has come from and where it's going. In the middle of 2019 onward, the Russians were really pushing to get all of the regional players involved in Syria, as well as de facto the United States, the European Union, as well, and major European players, to accept that Assad has won the civil war and that Bashar al-Assad would essentially regain control of most of Syria. We had the issue then with what was going to happen to the Kurdish areas. Would they continue to exist as a kind of autonomous, neither with Assad but not really against him, which provoked a crisis with the Turks? The Trump administration made it very clear that it was not interested in inserting itself between Turkey, Assad's forces, the Russians, and the Kurds. You ended up having a settlement being brokered. And I think the point that Bob raised is that from the Russian perspective, they don't expect any of these ceasefires to last, but what is part of their strategy is just to keep kicking the proverbial can down the road, as Joshua Landis referred to a few days ago in commenting on this, that the Russians aren't looking for a final long-term settlement. They're looking for things that de-escalate today and keep open the possibility for things tomorrow. Towards the end of 2019, my read is that the Turks were really beginning to try to make the case that Idlib would enjoy really a de facto independence from the regime, that this was a basis for negotiation between what's left of the opposition and the Assad government in Damascus, and that the Turks would somehow want to preserve a degree of independent action for the opposition. I think that what the Russians decided to do is to throw their weight behind the Syrians to try to deliver such a decisive defeat to the opposition that then they could say, the opposition, you've been broken. Now it's time for Turkey to come to the table and accept, in essence, the reality of Assad's permanent survival. I think that is why this crisis is happening, why it began to happen when it did. And then what I think is also interesting, and what it says, not just simply for the Russians in Syria, but it says something about the Russian approach to strategy in general in 2020, is that the Russians are willing to take risks and to escalate in a way that earlier they were not. That is, they were willing to really press hard against the Turks. And then to do that, and I think why they escalated at the time that they did, was that this is part of a strategy which one could say is paying at least some short-term dividends of really convincing President Erdogan of Turkey that his Western allies in NATO, both the United States as well as the Europeans, are not going to completely have his back. Because if you recall, when the heat began to build up between the Russians and the Turks in Idlib, and there was the threat of that there might actually be direct clashes, you had the death of Turkish servicemen due to the airstrike in Idlib, and Erdogan began to really sound the alarm, saying, well, we need Americans to send Patriot missiles, help us create a no-fly zone over Idlib. I'm prepared, Turkey is prepared to close the Bosphorus to Russian military transit, citing the provisions in the Montreux Convention that if Turkey feels its national security is threatened, it can block egress from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. And so for a period of time, and there was this sense that perhaps Turkey was swinging back to a closer relationship with the West, that Erdogan's romance with Putin once again was on the rocks. And the Western response rhetorically was very strong, but I think that my read is that Ankara felt that once again, as in 2015, that the rhetoric was not matched with necessarily all of the concrete capabilities that the Turks were looking for. In turn, the Turks decided that they weren't going to just simply continue to do the EU's business in terms of keeping migrants out of the European Union. And so what you end up with now is, in my read, Erdogan goes to Moscow, signs a ceasefire. It may, as Bob said, this is probably not going to last, but it kicks the can down the road. It puts Putin a bit back in the driver's seat. And now the same NATO allies, particularly Greece, but other NATO allies that Turkey would be expected to rely upon for help in the event of any clash with the Russians, are now the European allies that are being alienated by this potential new wave of migration coming in. So when Erdogan in Brussels earlier this week, not exactly a very productive meeting, not one where I think that the main European powers feel particularly confident. And from the Russian perspective, if in February you thought that Russia was going to be isolated in Syria and that the Turks were really swinging back towards alignment with the United States, in this first week, moving into the second week of March, Turkey is back to this middle position it occupies, kind of trying to balance back and forth between Moscow, Brussels, and Washington.
Bob, I know that you had some experience out in Syria. If you agree sort of that the Russians are willing to take risks or at least push the envelope a little bit to push the ball forward to try and settle this on their own terms?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you'll hear a lot of people inside the U.S. government, the U.S. military, when they talk about the Russians, talk about escalate to de-escalate. In other words, they would intentionally create crises on the ground in Syria and escalate to get the attention of the U.S., and then they would suggest a meeting or a phone call or something to de-escalate the situation. But every time they do that, they move the ball sort of incrementally upfield for them toward where they're trying to go. And so, and I think they are more risk tolerant because, one, I think that they have higher order interests at stake in Syria that they feel like they do, and I think most Westerners would agree that the way Russia defines its security interests, it's got more at stake in Syria than the West does. And so that makes it a little more risk tolerant. And then also, I think in terms of the amount of military power that it can bring directly to bear, I actually think the Russians are at a disadvantage. The U.S. is still only has, we're down to about 500 to 700 troops in Syria now total, the majority being in the northeast, and then there's a garrison near Al-Tanf along the Syria-Iraq-Jordan border. So the Russians have more boots on the ground, but in terms of air power, right, or the ability to deliver long-range fires and things like that, I think they're actually at a military disadvantage, and so that probably makes them more risk tolerant, right? they have to be more risk acceptant to even the balance. And so, yeah, I do think Nick's right that they've been willing to take risks that we haven't, because they have higher order security interests at stake, and I think they're conscious of the military disadvantage, at least in air power over Syria.
Yeah, I mean, both of you guys are more of an expert on the Russia side of this than I am, and I think that's one of the real big benefits of bringing this together. Is one thing that I'm kind of batting around in my head, okay, is that even with the Turkish retaliation, so Ankara did, to considerable effect, use in particular armed drones to take out armor, infantry, and in at least perhaps up to 8 instances, elements of mobile air defense systems that were shot up to the north. Mm-hmm. But they weren't able to sustain sort of an offensive push, right? So the opposition forces that they took back one town, were only able to hold it for maybe a day or two, depending on when you date it, and ultimately the Russians were able to claw it back with their air power. And this is despite Ankara, shooting down 3 Syrian regime jets, 2 Su-24s and 1 L-39. Do the Russians come out of this going, well, the Turks really put a hurting on us? Or do the Russians come out of this and saying they really put a hurt on the regime, but we got what we wanted? And I'm actually not sure about that. I'm curious what both of you think. I mean, maybe Nick, you want to?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, which is, it is important that Russia's interests and Assad's interests are not coterminous. That is, that just because something is bad for Assad doesn't necessarily make it bad for Moscow or for the Kremlin. And so that can a defeat for the regime not necessarily be a negative for Russia. And I think that you're seeing some of that, which is that we've already seen it in other parts of northern Syria, the Russians have acceded to Turkish zones of influence or Turkish security zones. And even if Assad says, every inch of Syrian territory must end up under my rule or we have failed, I think Russia is willing to accommodate Turkey. I think that what we've seen in Idlib, though, is that where Russia is willing to accommodate Turkey is part of that accommodation ends with any suggestion that the opposition to Assad is still a governing force or itself still controls territory or assets in northwest Syria. So I think that's where we're still seeing where the Russians are willing to, negotiate with the Turks. And of course, the Russians also have a bit of, and the Turks understand this, that they have a bit of leeway in that, as long as the planes or the personnel that are being impacted are described as Syrian regime forces, not Russian, even if the personnel may or may not be Russian citizens, that gives everyone a bit of leeway. So far the Turks can say, well, we have not directly attacked any Russians. Whether or not that's actually true or not, it's a plausible fiction on the battlefield in Idlib, and again reflects Turkey's sense that it can fight the regime, it can push back against the regime, but doesn't want to be seen as directly engaging formal Russian forces. At least that's my read. Bob, perhaps you may have a different take, or you might have something more information than I do on that. So I'll turn it over to you.
No, I think you're right, Nick. But I think both sides, right, have an interest in assuming that the attacks came. So, in other words, the 27 February attack on the Turkish forces, the Turks were very quick to attribute it to the Assad regime and not to implicate the Russians in any way. And Turkey has been fairly clear that its response was directed at the regime and pro-regime groups, but not at the Russians. And even I see the audio, the video of the Erdogan-Putin meeting. Putin made clear right up front, which I think this is simply not true, that the regime, the Syrian armed forces, were unaware that the Turks were in the area that they attacked on the 27th of February, and that it was a mistake. Of course, that no one really believes that, because the locations of the Turkish observation posts had been known to everybody for a long time, right? Ever since the de-escalation agreement went into force, all sides knew where each other's observation posts were. So, But both sides do, I think, have an interest in not publicly acknowledging that they either intentionally or accidentally might have attacked each other. In a larger sense, I think, Russia's rapidly approaching the point where it can't continue to tell all of its allies and partners in Syria what they want to hear without actually delivering results, right? So this Idlib problem really, in a lot of ways, is a creation of the Russians and the regime, because the opposition groups in Idlib are now sort of a petri dish of Turkish-supported, sort of what we would call moderate opposition groups, HTS, the Al-Qaeda affiliate, and then several other groups, many of whom were sent there after the Russians and the regime attacked other opposition-held areas that had been under de-escalation agreements. When they tore up the de-escalation agreements and attacked them, they would at some point offer the fighters free passage out of wherever they were, eastern Aleppo, Dara, and other places, and transportation into Idlib. And so now they've created this Idlib problem that I really don't know that they have a good solution for. Again, how to bring Idlib back under regime control and then disaggregate the moderate opposition from the terrorist opposition, the UN-designated terrorist groups, and then in a larger sense, how Russia and the regime will still deal with the United States, which really, the U.S. is a bigger problem, I think, even than Turkey for Russia and the regime in Syria, because as long as the U.S. stays where it is in northeastern Syria and in Al-Tanf, Assad can't reunite the country.
Right, and there's something I want to pick up there is that it's something that I've been thinking about, and Nick, I know you have thoughts on this. The Russians, I would say, have succeeded in their initial set of objectives, which was to ensure that the Assad regime would not fall. I think that's clear beyond a doubt. And I think that one of the reasons they have been so successful strategically is that their mission, at least the first bullet point you would put on a slide, was protect the regime at all costs. And that's really easy to do. I mean, at least sort of conceptually, whereas what the U.S. was doing was a lot more difficult to do because of the way we chose to do it. That's a whole other podcast.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to go into it, but it's fun. I mean, we can do that another time. It's a fun way to do it. But one of the things that I am left thinking is that the second bullet point on that slide would be solve Syrian crisis. And the second bullet point on that slide is TBD. Yeah. And I would say not really doing too well, even though the first bullet point is a check mark. So the other thing that comes up is how much resources does the state want to allocate? So something Bob said at the outset, which is Russia has more interest in Syria. I completely agree than the U.S. does, so they're willing to accept more risk, and they're probably willing to spend more money. Even if the amounts are less, as if you break it down into sort of the percentage of the allocation of resources towards public goods, they're probably, the Russians probably skew a little higher than us, even if it's just a dollar-for-dollar match. The U.S. operating costs are higher. Okay, I'm just trying to do that quickly. Something that's kind of unrelated, but something I wanted to bring into here is that we have an ongoing global economic downturn brought about by the ongoing pandemic. One of the reasons I'm at home, and if you hear any background noises like babies crying, that's because I'm at home. But the thing that I want to talk about was the Saudi-Russia spat that's going on, and the further downturn in global energy prices and what this may do to the Russian economy. Are they well positioned, to sustain current public spending, and will people start going, why are you spending money, sort of the guns or butter issue? Why are you spending money on faraway places when we're having trouble at home economically? I may be off. Again, I'm not really a Russia expert, but I'm curious to see if you can stitch those threads together, Nick.
Sure. I mean, Bob raised this point about a Russian predilection to escalate to de-escalate. And we're seeing the same pattern play out in the Russia-Saudi relationship when it comes to energy, which is that for several years we've had Russia and Saudi Arabia coordinating in order to try to keep global oil prices within a certain band that would help both the Saudi and Russian economies, and then, of course, by extension, other oil producers. The deal increasingly was unpopular among Russia's own energy companies that felt that it was hamstringing their production while giving a pass for the United States to continue to grow its own oil and gas export numbers. And with the coronavirus breaking out, with the collapse in global demand, the Russian perspective, or at least of the energy producers, was simply cutting more production won't really help prices, and it will just cut into our market share. This is a case too, which sort of shows, and this is for a separate podcast on the Eurasia side, but that as much as we think of Putin as an authoritarian figure, Russia is not a monolithic regime. There are interest groups, there are players who have influence, and in this case, the proponents of keeping the agreement with Saudi Arabia, particularly the energy minister, Alexander Novak, have lost ground, because one of the things that was expected was that there would be more Saudi investment in Russia. Saudis would do more to help Russia with dealing with financial sanctions, particularly from the United States. And the Russian business figures say, yeah, there's been some Saudi investment, but really not at the level that we expected. And so maybe we're not getting as much out of this deal. The Russian oil producers have also said the main enemy, and this is shades of the Cold War, main enemy. The main enemy is the United States in terms of its oil and gas production. And so why not use this economic downturn to really try to drive down or drive out of business at least the smaller U.S. producers. The bigger majors can absorb a degree of loss, and they can keep some of their domestic projects in the U.S. going. But let's just take the time to do this. Let's disrupt, but also it is designed to rattle the Saudis a bit, and to have the Saudis be in a position where they're going to go up against Russia in a price war. The Russian finance ministry has been preparing for this for several years. They've amassed reserves. If you trust the assessments of the finance ministry, they said they can sustain Russia's budget at $25 to $30 a barrel oil for the next 6 years, based upon the reserves that they've accumulated. That may be a bit optimistic. Your point about defense spending is correct, but again, if Russia feels that it's entering the end game in Syria, that you may be able to begin wrapping up some of the Syria campaign, and again, getting other regional powers to accept the reality of Assad. So Turkey, part of this clash in Idlib was to try to get Erdogan to really give up any last residual hope he had that maybe he could be part of a post-Assad transition. Saudi Arabia is the other regional player that for many years, ever since the Syrian uprising began, was hopeful that there could be a post-Assad Syria. Now that Saudi Arabia is going to have to spend more money at home, perhaps a bit less for what it could do in Syria. And here as well, I think it's a Russian stress test of how strong is the U.S.-Saudi relationship. If Saudi Arabia does not, because of it enters into an oil price war with Russia, what happens to all of those Saudi promises to really go ahead with a lot of high-ticket, big-budget purchases from the U.S.? Can Saudi Arabia sustain that under conditions of $25 or $30 a barrel oil? What's the U.S. reaction? We have, and again, another podcast I hope you'll be doing is there turmoil within the royal family based upon some of the moves that Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been making, and how will those play out in Washington? So I think the Russians decided this was a good time to remind Riyadh not to take Moscow for granted, escalate and then perhaps to see if they can de-escalate the oil war at some point in April.
Bob, I'm going to turn back to you because we're getting close to the end here. Idlib's not easy. Obviously, we have the Russians. And then I just got a thorough lesson in oil geopolitics, which I really appreciated. And I hope you write that down for FPRI, either Middle East or Eurasia, Nick, because that was fascinating. I mean, I don't know if we're in the business of giving policy recommendations, but maybe perhaps some things to think about and perhaps consider as we go forward, as the things to do in Syria, perhaps the implications, and maybe things that the United States could consider. And then Nick, I'll come to you maybe for some final thoughts.
Okay. Yeah. So, and also, if I could, Aaron, I wanted to pull on the thread you had there about Putin's popularity, and
Please do.
and is some of this related to, so the Russian government is not a democracy. We know that, but that doesn't mean it's not sensitive to public opinion. And the government in general, and Putin personally, have seen a sustained fall in their public opinion. If you look at the Levada Center polling since about July of 2018, so we're going on, we're going on 18 or 20 months of a sustained fall in public opinion. Now, Putin's approval ratings are still in the mid 60s, which is the envy of any Western politician, but nevertheless, for him, that's fairly low. And if you add to that, so I interviewed about 6 months ago a Russian political technologist, one of these guys who runs campaigns and does focus groups. And he claims that what he's seen since the huge spike in support for the government after the seizure of Crimea and the start of the war in eastern Ukraine in 2014 is that Russians are becoming, exactly as you said, Aaron, they're becoming more and more. There's more and more of a feeling among the Russian public that the government is engaged in these geopolitical adventures in Ukraine, in Syria, and other places, and is ignoring the concerns of ordinary Russians. So I think if you put those two together, the fact that there has been a sustained fall in support for Putin and for the government, and the fact that in these voter focus groups, people who run campaigns are seeing Russians more and more worried about their domestic economic fortunes and less enamored with Russia's status as a geopolitical heavyweight, that argues that I think the Russians are really interested in ending the Syrian civil war, right? And, Mike Kaufman and Matthew Rahansky wrote an article, it's been probably a year and a half ago, called What Kind of Victory for Russia in Syria, I think it was called. But anyway, what they mentioned, or what they argued, was Russia's strategy in Syria has always been dynamic or emergent, and they sort of outlined the advantages of that. Your standard, a Western strategy tends to be a little more rigid and a little more fully developed, and I think they're absolutely right that that type of strategy conferred some advantages on Russia, especially early in the war. But the problem with that type of strategy is when you have a dynamic or an emergent strategy, and you tend to end up just solving what immediate problem pops up. When you do that and you don't have a clear roadmap in mind of how we are going to get from where you are to, as you said, solve the Syria crisis, Aaron, as bullet number 2 in their strategy for Syria. But when you don't have a roadmap as to how you're going to get there, you end up solving immediate problems and creating bigger problems for yourself down the road. And I think that's sort of where they are with Idlib. They've created this problem of Idlib by clearing the rest of the country of anti-regime elements, whether they were moderate or jihadist, and now they've got them all together in Idlib, and the Turks are there, and now the Russians and the regime don't really know how to solve it. So in the piece I wrote for FPRI, I argued that to prevent a breakdown in relations between Turkey and the EU, to prevent a humanitarian disaster, it is worth looking at a safe zone or a no-fly zone in at least part of Idlib, maybe the northern and western parts of the province, that NATO countries would enforce. And I know that would be escalatory toward Russia and the regime. But I think it's something we could pull off at moderate cost and moderate risk. And I think the upside is that we potentially would prevent a war between NATO member Turkey and Russia, and a huge humanitarian crisis in Syria that would not stay contained in Syria, that would certainly move into Turkey and possibly from Turkey into the European Union.
Nick, any last words?
I think that that really is the question, which is the Russians are looking for what the Western response will be.
Yeah.
And they will adjust accordingly. If they think that there is a concerted response, they will change course. But right now, as of our position today in early March, the Russian view is they have once again reinserted some of the wedges between Turkey and the West. They're reinserting wedges between the United States and Europe. And they're going to see how long they can continue to maintain that position certainly before the April elections, which will ratify changes to the Russian constitution, which is the next critical date in the Russian calendar.
And just for clarification, those changes would allow Putin to stay on. I I don't remember the exact year. Basically, indefinitely.
Yes, if he so chooses, if he wishes to run again in 2024, these changes would clear the way to permit him to assume another term of office.
And those are 6 years in Russia, right?
Yes, those are 6 years. That is correct.
And how old is Putin again?
67.
All right, so that's well, good for him.
And Aaron, as Trevor Noah said, if he is president, Trevor Noah said this on last night. If he does do 2 more terms after 2024 and stay till 2036, by then he'll be 83, which will make him the exact right age to run for president in the United States. So. Again, that's stolen from Trevor Noah.
That's right. Yeah, and yeah, exactly. Okay, Nick and Bob, this has been great. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, thank you.
I think I want to give a shout out. I believe this was one of you two proposed this. So I can't remember who proposed this. Maybe it was you, Bob, or maybe it was you, Nick. And then Maya helped facilitate it. Maya is the deputy director of the of FPRI's Eurasia program, and all around fabulous at what she does. So thank you both for coming on. Thanks for this crossover podcast.
Have a good rest of the day, and thank you everybody for this.